Hello, third graders. I'm here with the Jumbies. Today we're going to be reading chapters 40 to 42. So, chapter 42, Rough Water. Waves crisscrossed and slapped against each other and the sides of Kareen's boat. The choppy water sprayed salty foam high above her. Kareen grew tired from pushing the boat away from the rocks. She couldn't avoid them all. The boat scraped along sharp edges and cracks appeared everywhere in the wood. The waves grew stronger. The boat was pushed in every direction. Kareen sat on her knees, working the oar to avoid destruction while the sea crashed over her and stung her eyes. She shivered, soaked to the skin, and her arms ached. The base of the cliff was still too far away. Now the boat was heading straight for a large, jagged rock. Kareen moved to the front to try to push away from it, but the boat was moving too fast. She screamed. In the moonlight, Kareen thought she saw the silver flash of a huge fishtail hit the side of the boat, shoving it out of the way of the rock at the last moment. She wiped salt water from her eyes to see better, but the creature was gone. Was it real or her imagination? She felt the boat being pushed by some unseen force, and soon she came to a still channel that led to the base of the cliff. "Thank you, Grandpierre," she said to the waves. Then Kareen looked at the slippery, foam-flecked rocks that rose to the sky above her. She longed for a moment to catch her breath, but the moon was already high in the sky. It was time to climb. She searched the black rock for a foothold or a notch for her hand, but she saw only wet rocks and crevices filled with sharp barnacles and pieces of shell. A great wave broke against her and the little boat. She braced herself with the oar and heard it crack and split in two. Water ran down the rocks, revealing crumbled barnacles in a nook. It made just enough space for her hand. She used the jagged edge of the fractured oar to scrape away the bits of barnacle that remained and reached up. As another wave gathered its strength to crash into the boat, Kareen pulled herself up by one hand. The fingers of her other hand found a tiny hold, and she curled her toes to grab onto the slippery rock. Just as she left the boat, the wave crashed down, smashing it. The boat's yellow planks were sucked into an eddy. The boat that let her know her papa was always near had disappeared forever. Kareen bit her lip and moved upward. The farther she went, the drier the rocks were and the easier to hold. She made sure she had a firm grip in one place before she moved to another. As she neared the top, a smooth, flat rock hovered over her. It jutted out with no place for her hands and the final obstacle to reaching the necklace. Kareen had no choice. She was going to have to jump away from the cliff and grab the edge of it with both hands. If she missed, there were only the briny water and the sharp rocks to welcome her below. She clutched the cliffside, nearly frozen with cold and fear. The wind whipped through her wet hair and clothes. She squeezed her eyes shut and thought about her father, how his eyes had glassed over, unseeing like the murky surface of a swamp. He needed her. She thought about Balki and Malik taking on the doings. They needed her. She thought about Drew in her noisy house. She needed her too. But who did Kareen need? Who did she have to turn to now? Above Kareen, her mama's necklace twisted in the wind, and its stone's shiny surface blinked back moonlight. Kareen could just make out its light. Her mama was there. She was almost close enough to touch. Kareen gathered all of her strength, crouched, and jumped. The fingers of one hand caught the top of the rock, but the other slipped and her leg smacked against the cliff. A flood of warmth spread up through her leg, the same leg she'd cut open just a few days ago. She scrambled and found another grip for her left hand. Then she pulled herself up. Her leg left a long streak of blood shimmering against the face of the rock. She found a place for her foot and pushed herself over the top of the cliff. She lay on the edge for a while as her heart pounded and her thigh bled. The sound of fighting in the village echoed on the rocks. The Jumbies were busy. Kareen knew that there wasn't much time to figure out her mama's magic. She pushed herself up to stand and limpered over to where the necklace dangled. She untangled it from the dead branch Severin had tied it to and turned the smooth stone in her hand. What was it about this stone that had hurt Severin, and why didn't it hurt Corinne? She was a Jumbie too. In the moonlight, Corinne saw a few nicks and scratches on the face of the small stone, and there was nothing remarkable looking about it. She squinted, hoping to detect something useful, some writing or an image she had not noticed before that would tell her what she needed to do, but there was nothing. As Corinne examined the necklace, an old woman stepped out of the forest and onto the cliff. When Corinne looked up, the woman smiled, then shed her skin and burst into yellow flames. Corinne backed up to the cliff's edge. She was trapped. Chapter 41, The Logahoo. Drew tried to stay still in the bush to avoid brushing against the stinging leaves. The Logahoo drew itself up to its full height, with chains clinking around its neck and waist. It turned to the full moon and bared its teeth. Drew held her breath. Even the fly in the spider's web stopped struggling. Drew covered her eyes, waiting for the Logahoo's teeth to pierce her skin. In the space between her fingers, she glimpsed a small orange glow. Fire. The match she dropped had landed on some dry leaves among her twigs. The flame was gathering strength. It caught onto the hairy leg of the Logahoo. The smell of burning fur filled the air. The Logahoo rushed forward and fell against the bush that had entangled Drew. The force of the crash freed Drew. Only torn bits of her shirt and a few strands of hair were left behind. The fire spread from the Logahoo to the branches of the bush, well outside the clearing Drew had created. Her blood ran cold with horror. The Logahoo howled and began to tear itself away from the stinging bush. Drew seized a stick and thrust its end into the flame. Despite her fear of causing more damage, it was the only weapon she had. She waved the fiery end at the Logahoo to keep it away from her. The creature snarled at her. Drew poked and jabbed as she tried to remember which direction led home. The Logahoo swiped at Drew, and fire lit up its arm. Quickly, its upper body was covered in flames. The Logahoo roared and twisted, trying to escape the fire. Drew dropped the stick and began to run. The Logahoo grabbed a clawful of Drew's hair and pulled. And Drew landed on her back with a thud. Now the creature was completely covered in flames, and it howled in agony. Drew jumped to her feet and ran. The heat of the fire and the scent of the burning fur followed her as she raced, screaming through the forest. Finally, she reached the open air and moved as fast as she could through the field towards her house. The burning smell stayed close. When Drew made it to her village, her family and neighbors stood in the middle of the road, their horror-filled face lit by the orange glow of the fiery creature. But when Drew looked back, there was nothing behind her. There was just the forest in the distance, consumed in orange flames and the burning smell, too close to be the forest. Cold water poured over Drew, and then her mother's arms held her tight. Drew was the one who had been on fire. She reached up to touch her hair, but found only wet ash. Her lovely hair had been burned. Poor Drew. Chapter 42, Captured. Bauki's skin grew moist from the damp air and the fear seeping out of his pores. He looked over at his brother to find that he was slick with sweat too. Another scream pierced the air and bounced off the trunks of the trees around them. The Duin that dragged them was joined by several others. They called to each other through the trees. "Oh, oh, oh!" "Kick, brother!" Bauki shouted. Together the boys kicked as hard as they could, but neither could free themselves from the Duin's grip. It was like being trapped in stone. A moment later, the scent of the fire came in, and the wind and the Duins all stopped to sniff the air. Then the sound of feet running, bellies slithering, and wings beating rose up like a wave. The Duin let go of the two boys and ran on its clumsy backward feet to the others. The little Jumbie completed a circle that surrounded Bauki and Malik. Bauki scrambled to his feet and pulled Malik up to face the tiny band of spirits. They were small like babies, but their muscles were tough like those of grown men. The Duins closed in. One of them began to whistle a little song, calm and pleasant despite the commotion around them. Then they all joined in. It was sweet and low and seemed familiar to Bauki. He puckered his mouth into an O to join them. Just as Bauki took a breath to whistle, Malik clapped his hand over Balki's mouth. Malik shook his head and put one finger to his lips. Balki understood. This was how the Duins trapped children. This was the magic they used to turn children into Jumbies like themselves. It had happened to Drew's friend, Alan, and if Malik hadn't figured it out, he would have been next. The Duins whistled louder and moved in. Malik pointed to something that looked like a path. Then he pointed up in the air. Balki nodded again. As soon as the Duins got close enough, the boys leapt over the Jumbies' heads and made for the trail. A loud thud made them look back. Hugo's large broken pallet had come down on the head of one of the Jumbies. "Go!" he shouted at the boys. They both took off running. Behind them, Balki heard Hugo beating the little men, and then a crack like wood breaking. The boys had not gotten very far when Hugo's large arms scooped them up. Balki felt squashed under Hugo's arm, but he didn't complain. Hugo dodged high roots and low branches. Balki was surprised that carrying two boys did not seem to slow Hugo down. Balki looked behind and saw the Duins helping up their fallen brothers, but they were far enough away from the little Jumbies. Balki, Malik, and Hugo were safe. All right, we will have to see what happens next to Miss Corrine and Drew. Have a good day, guys.